In the 1930s, researchers at Yale University, led by Carl Hovland, began studying the process of persuasion from a social scientific perspective. That is, they attempted to rigorously test hypotheses about how people are persuaded and how people engage in the process of persuasion using the scientific method and controlled experiments. The first thing that any researcher must do when beginning to study a phenomenon empirically is to clearly define the phenomenon that they wish to study. One of the most widely accepted definitions of persuasion from the social scientific tradition is this: persuasion is symbolic communication between two or more people with an intent to change, reinforce, or create attitudes, beliefs, and/or behaviors. Let's unpack this definition just a little bit. The first thing to understand is that persuasion is symbolic. In other words, there is an agreed upon symbol system between the two or more individuals engaging in the process of persuasion. For this class, one agreed upon symbol system that we use is the English language. We use words as signs of the meanings we intend to convey. I can also make gestures that are symbolic and convey a meaning to you, and may, in some instances, be persuasive in nature. Now, there are some who would argue that just about everything is persuasive. For example, the color of walls in restaurants. However, for our purposes in this class, and for the purposes of any social scientific exploration of the construct of persuasion, we're not going to accept that as an instance of persuasion because it doesn't use an agreed upon symbol system. Second, as we continue to unpack this definition of persuasion, it's important to understand that persuasion is something that happens between two or more people. So, as much as you might like to claim credit for persuading your dog to go to the bathroom outside or to fetch his bone for you, your excellent persuasive abilities in this case don't really fit with our definition of persuasion because these instances fall outside of this idea of persuasion as being between two or more people. Similarly, some might argue that you could persuade yourself to do something, like go to the gym. But again, for a scientific approach of the study of persuasion, we must exclude that kind of definition. So, persuasion uses an agreed upon symbol system and it occurs between two or more people. The next integral part of this definition of persuasion is the idea that persuasion must have intent. I'll tell you right now, there are scholars of rhetoric from the more historical tradition of the study of persuasion who will argue that intent doesn't matter, that persuasion can exist without intent. And I'm not going to debunk that idea right now, but for the purposes of this class, we'll exclusively be considering persuasion where intent on the part of one or both parties is assumed. And the reason for this is that if you view anything, regardless of intent, as persuasion, there's no way to control or to isolate persuasion as a concept, something that is critical and necessary for the study of persuasion from a scientific perspective. So it's difficult to consider in a systematic way unless you can isolate what is and what is not persuasion. Now, one caveat goes along with this idea of intent. We don't always know intent, and at times we may infer intent where none exists. But it's also important to remember that persuasion does not have to be successful in order for it to be persuasion. In fact, persuasive attempts fail far more often than they succeed. But if the intent of the sender of the message is persuasive, under this definition of persuasion, it qualifies as persuasion. Researchers who study the process of persuasion have identified 3 things that can happen during a successful persuasion attempt. The first is change. This happens when the party to a persuasive attempt actually changes their attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. So, for example, a person who consumes several Cokes a day might encounter an article that contains a persuasive appeal about the negative health effects of sugary drinks, and as a result, might actually change their behavior to reduce their consumption of Coke. The second thing that can happen during a persuasive attempt is reinforcement. This happens when attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors are made stronger or more entrenched. So, for example, most people would agree that washing your hands frequently is a good thing. However, after seeing a sign that reinforces the importance of hand washing to stop the spread of diseases, might find that they are washing their hands even more frequently. The message has reinforced an already existing attitude, belief, or in this case, behavior. The final result of a successful persuasive attempt is the creation of attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. This happens when a persuasive attempt targets an attitude, belief, or behavior that simply doesn't yet exist in the target of the persuasion. You've heard of Febreze, right? Well, when Febreze was first introduced, the marketing team had a pretty difficult task in front of them. They had to actually create attitudes within consumers about Febreze as a product, because it was the first product of its kind that actually promised to remove odors, not just mask odors with a stronger but more pleasant smell. So 3 things can occur after a successful attempt at persuasion. The first is change, the second is reinforcement, and the third is the creation of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Now, the final part of this definition contains 3 key constructs that it's really important that you understand. I think Fishbein and Eizen's definition of the concept of attitude is probably the most widely recognized and accepted definition of attitude. They define attitude as a learned predisposition to respond in a consistently favorable or unfavorable way toward some attitude object. Now, by attitude object, it could be nearly anything, including objects, events, people, or even situations. A belief, on the other hand, is an object-attribute link. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And finally, a behavior is an observable physical action. Now, these are really important concepts to understand from a social scientific perspective on persuasion. So, in order to ensure that you have a clear understanding of the difference between attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, we're going to walk through each of them and provide you with a clear example so that you can identify what an attitude, belief, and a behavior is in the context of persuasive messages. Let's start with this idea of behavior, because it's probably the easiest of these constructs to understand. A behavior, according to Fishbein and Eitzen again, is any observable physical action. So exercising regularly, or reading books, or even eating at Burger King, shopping at farmers markets, all of these are observable physical actions. You can see someone doing the action, or someone else could watch you do that action, and so it fits the definition of behavior. The second construct that you should understand is the idea of a belief. A belief links an object to an attribute. Now, remember, again, we're talking about a scientific definition of belief. So when we say that a belief links an object to an attribute, the first thing that's important to understand about this is that a person could have multiple beliefs about an attitude object. And different people often have contradictory beliefs about that object. So, for example, let's say we have a Taco Bell Bacon Chicken Club Chalupa, and let's say we also have me. Now, I might have the following object attribute links related to the Taco Bell Chicken Bacon Club Chalupa. I might think that they are cheesy. So that is an attribute that I would assign to the Taco Bell Chicken Bacon Club Chalupa. I might also think that they are melty, that they are crunchy, delicious, and a good value for the money. Now, you'll notice that some of these beliefs are valenced. That is, they are evaluative, either positively or negatively. Now, on the other hand, First Lady Michelle Obama, who seems to think that it's her job to be the fat police, might have an entirely different set of object attribute links that would be salient in her evaluation of the Taco Bell Chicken Bacon Club Chalupa. She might think that the Taco Bell Chicken Bacon Club Chalupa is 490 calories, full of fat, crunchy, disgusting, and nasty. So all of these object attribute links are our beliefs about the Taco Bell Chicken Bacon Club Chalupa. So how does this lead into the idea of attitude? Well, now we're back to the concept of attitude, and as we've already discussed, an attitude is a learned predisposition to respond in a consistently favorable or unfavorable way toward some attitude object. Now, there are a few things that we know from research about attitudes that we can infer from this definition. First, attitudes are learned. They are not innate. You aren't born with attitudes, but rather you develop them over time as you learn and experience and grow. Next, attitudes are consistent. They typically change very slowly over time. Finally, attitudes are more affective, that is, they're more feeling-based than they are cognitive or thought-based. They have much more to do with your emotions than with your thoughts, although it is true that serious thought may have resulted in the emotions that you instinctively feel when confronted with a given attitude object. Now, the catch with the construct of attitude is this. We can't measure attitudes directly. It's not like a belief that we can ask someone about or a behavior that we can just observe. Attitudes, since they are a learned predisposition to respond either favorably or unfavorably towards some attitude object, they can only be inferred from a person's beliefs and behaviors. So, for example, let's say that you see Homer Simpson and you also see a donut. Now, Homer Simpson might express a belief or an object attribute link about that donut. Donuts are delicious. That is a belief. We have an object, a donut, and we have an attribute, delicious, and we know that Homer Simpson assigns this object to that attribute. So we understand what his belief is. We might also see that when Homer Simpson is confronted with the donut, that he begins running like a crazy man toward the donut so that he can eat it. This is his behavior. So from observing his belief that he stated and his behavior that we can see, we might infer that his attitude toward donuts is favorable, but we can't measure it directly. So I'm sure that now you understand the constructs of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, but you might be wondering how this all relates to the idea of persuasion. Well, it turns out that decades of social scientific research into persuasion indicate that beliefs and the evaluations of those beliefs, so do you feel positively or negatively about those object attribute links, lead to a person's attitudes, which are the best predictor of a person's ultimate behavior. Now, often, persuasion is focused on changing a person's behavior. For example, persuading someone to buy a certain product, or to exercise more, or to recycle or eat more vegetables. But it turns out you can't persuade a person to make these behavior changes without first targeting their beliefs and attitudes. And that's why you'll often hear about persuasion as a process. It usually doesn't occur after exposure to a single persuasive message. Instead, over time, persuasive messages change, reinforce, or create beliefs which, coupled with evaluations of those beliefs, form attitudes which ultimately are strongly related to actual behaviors. I hope that you now have a solid understanding of the process of persuasion from a social scientific perspective. This concludes a social scientific perspective on persuasion.